Welcome to another episode of It Depends with Eli and Sanjeev. This time we have a new guest on our show. So you've probably seen Eli, myself, Nick Hudecker, Travers, and today we have Joe Rappaport, who works at Meta, who has joined us. The topic for today is super exciting. It is synthetic data. The biggest challenge with AI and ML isn't algorithms or even finding the right skill set. Without high quality, accurate data collected from real world sources, even the best efforts for AI and ML will fall flat. But how do you collect real data with sufficient features? That's difficult. Sometimes you don't have access to all that real data. This is where synthetic data comes in. And in this episode, we will explore what is synthetic data, what are the different uses of synthetic data, how it's created, and what are the gaps that synthetic data introduces in our lives. So, with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe. Maybe since you are our guest of honor, maybe you can give us some background on your work with synthetic data.
Sure. So at the last two companies I was at, machine learning was part of my job. And a couple of the challenges that I came across that required synthetic data were having low observation events. Sometimes it was having no data at all. We were just building a model. A third instance that might have required it was when we had data that we wouldn't want to use directly, data that we want to maintain privacy on, maintain anonymity on, and that's where some of the synthetic data comes in.
Right, that's great. And Travis, you've been in app development for a long time. You want to talk about your experiences with synthetic data?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a part-time app developer, and no one would dare let me write production code these days. But I would not put myself on the level of some of the software engineers I know by any means. But certainly, I mean, when you're building an application and you don't have users, you need data. That's a good example. And you're trying to generate data in some ways. This term synthetic data is new for me. But lorem ipsum is my classic go-to for synthetic data. It's like, hey, if you need data now and you just need to fill space, then do that, right? But there's a lot of different ways that you can generate data. There's lots of different libraries out there. I've used Faker for Python, that kind of thing. So go ahead, Eli.
Yeah, I have to interject. Hey guys, what is synthetic data?
Yes, Nick.
Hey, and don't ask me.
So
No.
I mean, I know that it's artificially generated data, but I guess how is it generated? Why would just randomly generated data be relevant? Like, how is it generated? What's the algorithm? Is it close to real data? Like, is it use case specific or just, to your point, lorem ipsum? Like, is it just that?
No, it's not.
No, it's typically generated from real data, right? Like if you have a small sample that you can use, you can then develop variations on that. So you can take, it's synthetic data is basically data that's not created from actual events. It's from events that you might repurpose in a new way. I've seen a lot of articles about using synthetic data if you don't have, say, a very diverse data set, whether that's for race, for gender, et cetera. And that's typically where I've encountered it, right? If you want to train a machine learning model and you don't have the broadest possible data set, you would use synthetic data based on real data to generate a larger training and test set for your models.
So is it sanitized data then? I mean, are you taking the real data and just scrubbing off all of the specifics?
For some use cases, for data privacy, absolutely. You cannot use sensitive data. You're building a loan application model, and you can use actual data. So for that, it is scrubbed. But that's only one of the use cases. The bigger use case is generating artificial data based on real data because you just don't have enough data. I'll give you an example, and this is a true example. TSA in the US, they have a lot of machine learning models to screen things like our luggage, looking for prohibited items. So now these prohibited items are the way they train the models is on existing images, but there are only so many images they have. So a firearm could be hidden under clothes, it could be hidden under some food items, could be all over the place. So TSA takes the real data and it generates statistically related images to train, because it doesn't have as many images to do it otherwise. So that's an example.
So Joe, were you guys using like GPT-3? Like how, again, I'm just curious how the data was generated. Like were you feeding it real data and telling it to generate artificial data? Like how were you guys doing it?
One of the ways that we started out using it was just by bootstrapping our data set with more of the same records. So if we had some turnover model that had very few turnover instances at a given location, just multiplying the number of rows in the turnover model that represent people turning over. That's one way. It has a little bit of disparate effect for something that's supposed to be descriptive, like a turnover model where you're trying to ask the question, why is this happening? You risk kind of overfitting in the direction of creating correlation and potentially even describing causation where there isn't any. That's where we move over to a more advanced style of bootstrapping and synthetic data. And that is, instead of just replicating rows, creating statistically equivalent rows that then are truly representing the breadth of causes of turnover, but without actually having as many observed rows as you'd like.
And I'd like to make a distinction here between kind of what was described around like the scrubbing of data and data masking and obfuscation of the data versus what the scenario that Sanjeev described, right? I would call that historically something like test data management. And there's other use cases around that. Sanjeev was shaking his head no, right? But the example you gave around like sensitive data, right? Can developers access PII data or HIPAA data? Yeah. Can admins access that data, right? And you have to prove for compliance purposes that they cannot access that data. And so, if you're a developer and you're writing code and you're in the database and you're in a lower level non-production environment, you have to be able to use that data and not be able and prove that, you're not accessing PII as an example, right? And so that traditionally has been called just test data management. And I don't know if Sanjeev disagrees with that, but that's a lot different than this kind of idea of synthetic data or, with the TSA example he gave.
So Travis, great point. When synthetic data first hit my radar a couple of years ago, I was surprised. I was like, wait, test data management is synthetic data, because it's data that has been obfuscated, and now because I cannot use production level data, so I've redacted sensitive data, and now I'm doing my testing with it. So why is that not synthetic data? So and theoretically, it is synthetic data. Theoretically, any data that does not originate from its original source is synthetic data. But the modern definition of synthetic data says test data management data was rule-based. Synthetic data is AI and ML based. So the difference is that in the past, when I created test data management, I would have some sort of rules that would say, change the employee ID, create a unique sort of a seed value and increase it by a counter. So it was very rule based. Today, by using machine learning, we are trying to maintain the context of that data. So it's so that's a modern definition, and that's why we have so many different companies that are funded by VCs, because they see there's huge potential that the modern synthetic data is going to be far more intelligent compared to the old test data management.
So So let me ask you, gentlemen, and we're missing Anna today. She would have given us some more color instead of all you dudes, but shout out to Anna. But let me ask you this. So there's all of these tools today that, for example, there's a tool that I'm looking at that would allow me to automatically create a newsletter for my subscribers that is based off of AI generated data off of my specific topic. Or I'll give you another example. If a research company, maybe a Gartner, would take its entire research library and feed it into this machine and then allow the machine to create research, would that be a form of synthetic data?
No, I wouldn't say so.
Okay.
That's
No, because it's basically summarization, right? Or encapsulation, however you want to describe it. So it's taking, it's creating a new product, right? Whereas synthetic data is, here's the data that you've been using to train. Joe, correct me if I'm wrong. Here's the data that you've been using to train. Let me try and fill gaps in that data, so I have a broader data set that I can use to train this model. Sanjeev, to your point earlier, is test data different from synthetic data? And you said, test data is based on rules. I'm sorry, that's what a machine learning algorithm is. It's a series of rules that change over time.
No.
You and I are going to disagree on this one. Okay.
I love it when we disagree. It depends.
It's effectively the same thing, right? I mean, because you're still using it for testing, you're using it for training.
You have destroyed machine learning, Nick.
I'm happy to destroy machine learning.
I would agree that synthetic data neatly falls into that. Like anything coming as an output of machine learning isn't synthetic data. Synthetic data is almost by definition the thing that you put into the machine learning model when you don't have the real data. Anything coming out as an output isn't synthetic. Synthetic data maybe in the dictionary definition, but not in the way that it's utilized in the industry. The way that we talk about synthetic data is what you're putting in when you don't have just enough records or rows or accurate rows or diverse rows or in the case of privacy, rows that you're actually allowed to touch, and instead you should be using truncated rows.
So is there a concern that if your synthetic data set is based on your current data set, you're still not able to adjust for biases in that data, right? Like if there's 5 of us on this podcast right now, if I'm using our images to generate more synthetic data, I would wager that data that was just created is going to look a lot like 5 guys on a podcast. So was that a concern as you were using synthetic data in some of your algorithm development?
We were conscious of that. And then in fact, you're talking about one of the legitimate use cases of synthetic data that's been brought up before, and that is diversifying what's in the actual data set itself to make it more externally applicable. I think that if you go in the direction of wanting a predictive model as opposed to a, say, descriptive model, one where you don't really care about the why, as long as the black box puts out an output that gives you a positive expected value on your total bet, then that's where creating whole cloth information, adding randomization, whether it's twisting and turning the shape of a gun or changing something.
Differential privacy, noise, adding some noise.
Exactly. All of those are all about not necessarily concerns that you have maybe ethically, but it's more about creating that positive EV. And that's about your confusion matrix and how much lift you get from a true positive versus a false negative.
Okay.
Joe, why wouldn't I have the data? Like, why would there be missing data that I would need synthetic data for? Can you give me maybe I can appreciate the conversation. What I'm failing to appreciate is I want a real world use case of, hey, I'm a restaurant or a bank or whatever, and I need this specific synthetic data to solve X problem.
Sure. I got 2 examples for you. One is, let's say historically you haven't been tracking all attributes, and let's say you switch over to a new system that doesn't track some of the old attributes, but you still want to use them. Imputing information as the operator is a valid way of increasing the predictiveness of your model when you didn't track the information or now you're not tracking it. And so you're just using some historical time frame reference to add the data back into the system that didn't have it. The second example would be where you have an incredibly large data set, but the thing that you're trying to observe or guess at just doesn't occur enough for you to have some statistical significance. And so you're really trying to achieve that statistical significance where right now there isn't any.
Interesting. Okay.
I would bring up another example, Eli, which is content moderation. So you think about, any web-based platform, you're uploading images, you have to be able to detect offensive content, right? Illicit images, videos, whatever that is. And I think that's a kind of a interesting line, right? Because as the provider, you're wanting to prevent those things on your platform. But in order to do that, you're going to have to train a model, and that model needs data. And if that model is going to be any good, you need lots of data, like a lot.
I agree with you. And to be honest, I think Sanjeev's example was the one that really resonated with me. Like, that's the use case that I can definitely see is, hey, TSA wants to be able to detect, a specific type of object for whatever, whatever it is. I think that makes total sense. What I was trying to figure out is, okay, so that's one use case that makes a lot of sense. I can appreciate that, hey, in order to detect whether it's a real gun, I don't want to talk about specifically weapons, but whether it's a real thing or a fake thing, you need a lot of information. You need to be able to train the model. Got it. What else can it solve for from a business perspective?
Can I give another example? Picking on what Nick was saying earlier, loan approval models are highly problematic. Who should a bank give loans to? Because they are trained on existing models that are just filled with bias. And I think that Nick, I think you mentioned the bias before. So if you train it on that, you are encoding the bias in the model. So now, so this is where banks run into huge issues because they've got two options. One, they can use highly sophisticated machine learning like deep neural network. But if you do that, then you get more accuracy, but you can't explain it because it is just too complex. So then you go to a simpler machine learning model like regression analysis, which is less accurate, but easy to explain. Either way, you have a problem. So now what banks are starting to say is that what if we build synthetic data and then we train a model on that. So when the regulators come, they can say, look, we didn't introduce any biases. This is synthetic data. So we are absolved of having sort of done any racial or gender bias. So that's...
Oh, but I can push back on that because, again, if somebody really wanted to do that, it's the type of information you're feeding it is the type of output that you can expect to get, right?
The focus has been for explainability. The focus has been very much on the model itself, right? People are typically not thinking about explainability based on the data that you're feeding it. But I think that will come, right? I think that's going to have they're part of ethical use of machine learning and whatever is going to be not just the model, but what data did you use to train this against? And so companies will need to be in a defensible position to say, I would expect to see some kind of some regulatory authority, or maybe it's the UN who comes out and says, here are the guidelines for ethical use and creation of synthetic data in a given problem domain, whether it's healthcare, whether it's finance, whether it's security. I would expect that to happen just because these things impact a lot of lives, not just loans, but crime prediction, right? You're seeing courts start to use algorithms to say, what is the likelihood of recidivism if I let this person go? So,
oh God, we're building Minority Report. Joe, are we building Minority Report?
Precogs.
Well, there was a fantastic article. I think it was in a newspaper in Chicago, so in your town, Elias, talking about how the algorithm said that this person would commit a crime. And so the cops rolled by and said, hey, we've got you fingered for this.
I'm going to pre-arrest you.
Even though
Yeah.
they didn't do that, but the cops effectively said, we're watching you, right?
You're guilty unless proven innocent.
And then I believe the person, I read this a while back, so the details might be hazy, but then the person got shot, right? Did the person get shot because of the algorithm or because the police started coming around all the time? And so, what actually happened? And so, I think there's going to be not just model explainability, but data explainability as well. And synthetic data has a role to play there.
In fact, to be honest, I find synthetic data to be hugely useful, but hugely problematic at the same time. It's like any new technology, there are bad actors that can, the technology to create synthetic data is now so easily available and it is so cheap that you can create variations of people's videos, images, other kind of data that is hard to tell whether it's real or not. So I think we're entering a world where synthetic data is going to create huge amount of problems, and I agree. There'll have to be all kinds of regulations that'll have to come in place. Otherwise, any kid can take this video and completely mimic our voices and change the message.
So, Joe, I want to throw this back to you, if I can. Travis, one second. When you were using synthetic data in scientific research, et cetera, did these issues, were they conversation topics? Were executives interested about them? Were they just saying, just give me an answer? What was the executive kind of response here, or did those conversations not happen?
So on the two sides to working in HR analytics, one is on the HR side, there was a very large and serious conversation about the ethics and acceptability of using the information in the way that we wanted to, whether we were bootstrapping or creating information from whole cloth. Those conversations happened. On the receiving end of the executive side of delivering the information, there's not so much skepticism of the synthetic data and how we get it and how we make it. That's mostly just trusted and accepted as doing business, the cost of doing business.
Okay.
Is that because of a lack of understanding, Joe? Because they didn't understand it's a complicated topic, or do you really believe it's, to your point, just the cost of doing business?
I think both are valid. One is that only an app developer or a machine learning scientist or an analyst is going to be the one that kind of fully understands the implication of this data, synthetic data, or if it's explained. Certainly any kind of lay audience could. But on the other side, it's also that what people care about is that EV, right? We're expecting an outcome. How predictive is our model? How descriptive is our model? And what actions are we taking because of it? Is it going to cost us money? Is there some risk involved? That's really what executives care about.
So let me ask you all this quick question. I mean, a long time ago, I used to work for a trading company, futures trading downtown Chicago. And they were building all these algorithms for black box trading. I mean, essentially, they were trying to make money by training an algorithm. And this was over 10, 12 years ago. So how is that different than what we're talking about now? I mean, isn't it kind of similar? I mean, they were also feeding it a ton of information and building an algorithm that could trade and make predictions on whether the stock is up or down or the futures market is up or down.
So they were most likely using existing data, and maybe they did some modifications to it, but it wasn't sophisticated. Modifying existing data and creating synthetic data can be quite easy. Like you can just say tokenize or mask all the credit card numbers. So now you've got data that's synthetic, but but it's still real data. It's not like the variety hasn't increased, the volume hasn't increased. It is just, redacted data. So it's not really that useful. What synthetic, so this trading company that you were at 10, 12 years ago, what they were doing was they were running different kinds of models and seeing what is the impact. If I, run, let's say a knife base, what is the outcome? If I run a random forest, what is the outcome? So they were doing that, but the data itself was not changing. Today, what we are saying is that the data has exploded. In fact, when synthetic data first came into the market, we were cheering because we said, oh, wow, now you can get the benefit of big data without the liability. So, but I think that
Here's where you're losing me, and I mean I appreciate everything, and again I don't know much about this, but here's where you're losing me. So my problem is we're in the age of data. There's so much data. There's more data than we know what to do with. Yet we're talking about AI generated data, synthetic data.
Well, it still needs to be fit for purpose, right? Like not all data is the same level of quality. It may not have the same labels or tagging that you need. My customers at Cribble, like they're processing hundreds of terabytes, sometimes petabytes of data a day. Is that all suitable for machine learning training? Absolutely not. But that's not always the intent. To Sanjeev's point, there's enough trading data that it's easy to back test your models using existing data. What synthetic data doesn't do is tell you that all of a sudden there's going to be these meme stocks that people are bumping on Reddit, and your model can't predict that. And so there's always things that are going to be outliers that even with the best of intentions, you simply cannot model, right? These black swan events, like a pandemic that lasts 2+ years, these are things that are really difficult to reflect in your model.
Very well put. Actually, I want to say, staying on with Nick. So, Nick, I've also come across there's this concept of synthetic monitoring, where like Datadog has a module for synthetic monitoring, where it's not enough to monitor the actual data. Since you're in the monitoring field, has that shown up on your radar?
It has not yet, honestly. It's something I'll have to look into, but no, not something I've encountered.
Okay.
So, well, now I'm curious. So, and this is for all of you. Maybe we start with Joe and Travers, since. So, if I'm a customer and I want to use this, like, who are the vendors? How would I apply this? Who are the more popular players in this space?
Well, you don't always need to engage with the vendor here. No one's going to know more about your data than you, right?
But so how do I like? Where do I feed the data? Like, is this a cloud-based model? Like, how does it work? Like, maybe break down the architecture for me. Is it open source? Do I just deploy it on like a container?
I'm aware of a number of open source projects in the Python environment that you can use to generate synthetic data. And Python is very much, Joe will refute me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong. But Python seems to be the language of data science and machine learning in a lot of ways. So I've seen a lot of that you would then put into whatever data store you're using. But Joe, I'm going to throw it over to you on this.
Yeah, so I haven't used any vendors. From the simplest version, it's like 2 or 3 lines of code. And then when you get more complicated, there are those Python libraries that Nick's talking about that can get as complicated and as useful as you are skilled. But Travers, have you used any?
I've just used Faker, which is a Python library. It's pretty simplistic, straightforward. I mean,
so is this GPU intensive, CPU intensive? Like, it needs something to run against this data, right?
It's just effectively a Python library. I don't know how CPU or just writing a script referencing a library on a single server. I've been able to generate millions of records. So not necessarily GPU or CPU intensive. This is on a small box. I was able to do this, right? So, resource wise, it wasn't a problem.
The type of data matters here too.
My use case was for data seeding, right? So
yeah,
we're just seeding data, and I can blow away the database and then run the seeder, blow it away, run the seeder, So.
Yeah, if you're generating text data, I think you get one set of performance constraints. If you're generating, say, image data, to Sanjeev's earlier example, you're having different performance constraints.
And oftentimes you're looking to source image data from, lots of different places, right? I mean, how much image data can you actually just generate versus, going to some, commons library or something or targeting it like that. I'll just say, just on a practical standpoint, I've used synthetic data in the past, and I don't know if it was synthetic data, but what we called synthetic transactions. And this is a common pattern in the integration space, and it actually helps with things like troubleshooting. So once you're live in production and something goes wrong and you try to reproduce that, you have to have a mechanism or capability within your system so that you can run transactions to try to reproduce those things, right? And that requires, effectively dummy transactions or synthetic data, whatever you want to call that. But that just from a practical standpoint, operationally, if you're going to do troubleshooting, root cause analysis, that kind of thing, that would be one of my recommendations, that you have that mechanism in place before you go live in production with any system.
Yeah. So there's a very vigorous community of synthetic data companies, and I know when we were in Gartner, Travis, Nick, there was like cool vendors. There were some cool vendors in that space. There's a company called Hazy.ai, which was last year nominated as a cool vendor. So there are a bunch of companies in this space.
Do they specialize based on data type, by industry?
Yeah.
Any idea?
Yes, actually they do. I think Hazy.ai, the two companies we were looking at, mostly AI and Hazy AI. If I'm not mistaken, Hazy.ai was primarily focused on financial services.
Okay.
Well, shout out to Hazy.ai. Someone should come on the show and talk to us about synthetic data.
Yes.
No, this has been really helpful. Thanks, Joe, for joining us.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Well, Joe, I actually, out of curiosity, I have one more question for you. So were there any lessons learned, anything that you say you would maybe do differently if you were to do it again? Would you consider what you guys did successful? Like, give us some, in the trenches type of stuff.
Sure. So some of the problems that we ran into with model development, I'd say there's a refrain in data science that 99% of modeling is wrangling data. And I found that to be true. That one of the first and most useful places that I used synthetic data wasn't even in like tuning a real model. It was having a large fake data set to check that the model, an entire development pipeline was going to work, that model was going to take in the information. What was it going to do if it found blank information, bad information? It was a linear model, so a lot of multi-collinearity. Like, how does it handle all those exceptions without just shit in the bed? That was the most useful place. From there, I'd say that it's really about the skill of the operator and understanding how the information is going to affect your model in the way that you want it to. There's no real shortcut in practice and expertise, but the one thing I would say is don't be afraid. Go for it.
Yeah. Well, you bring up a really good point, and this is for all of you too. Like, how would someone that's watching us or listening to us would go about acquiring these skills? Is this, someone that's a data scientist? Is this more of a developer? Like, how would you acquire these skills?
I can only speak for myself as more of a citizen data scientist, and that's practice. But just start working with it. How about Nick, Travers, anything?
No, like you said, it's a skill you'd have to develop. It's not particularly challenging to go get these packages and start to generate data. It's more about, I think, the domain knowledge. It's not the mechanism of actually generating the data. It's, do I know enough about the space I'm in to generate relevant synthetic data?
And is this type of skill set in demand? Like, are there a lot of job openings that you guys are seeing specifically asking for synthetic data specialist or data scientist?
No, I think it's a task that people just have to do, right? Mm-hmm. Like, if you want to train your model and you don't have enough data, you're going to have to make
You
some.
have to go figure it out. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think necessity is, spawns innovation, right? So I think having a practical use case really makes a lot of sense. Like if you want to automate content moderation, that's an example I came across. So that's all I would say. The Udemy's of the world and the online tools are great for getting some kind of high level conceptual knowledge, and they tend to have some kind of projects. But if you have an opportunity to apply this in the real world, where you have production level processes, you have more rigor around your applications, you have more people involved, a team involved, I would say that's the way to do it.
Well, I definitely learned something very interesting today. So thank you to all of you for all of the information. I think this was really helpful. Joe, we loved having you. You're going to have to come back on another episode of It Depends. We'll talk about maybe other topics as well, and other things that you're doing or that you've done. We'd love to have that.
Like I said, anytime.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, folks, this has been another episode of It Depends on synthetic data. We hope you found value and learned something interesting. I think we all certainly did here. If you liked the episode, make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast. We're trying to release these at least a couple of times a month, so make sure you stay tuned to the next podcast. And we'll see you all next time.